Shabbat Shalom. Just a few weeks ago, we read the story of Noah's Ark. We read about the great flood and God's do-over with humanity. But the second half of Parshat Noach offers another part of the story. And over the last week, as I have been watching the various takes on election results here, there, and everywhere, I have been itching to dive deeper into this part of the story. So let me take you back a couple of weeks and tell you a bit about the Tower of Babel. After the great flood occurred, humanity began to rebuild. They all spoke the same language, shared the same words, and decided to settle together in the land of Shinar. There they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and build ourselves a city, and a tower with its top in the heavens. Let us make a name for ourselves, lest we be scattered over the face of the earth." It sounds at first like a story of cooperation and progress, everyone working together toward a shared goal. But the Torah hints at something deeper. This was a society obsessed with uniformity. No one questioned, no one differed. The tower became a symbol not of connection to God, but of control, of human arrogance, and the desire to build a world where everyone thought and acted the same. The text reads, "God descended from the heavens to look upon the tower that was built before exacting judgment upon its builders." The commentators take from this that the act of building the tower itself was not inherently wrong, but the danger was the purpose of its building and the motives of its builders. The story has an interesting perspective on the way lack of communication leads to dehumanization. As the sages tell it, if a person fell and died as they were building, no one noticed. But if a brick fell, they wept. The project was more important than the people. The humanity of each individual person and the perspectives they brought was irrelevant, because it was all about the strength that numbers provided them. As I mentioned earlier, the text tells us that every human being understood one another. There's some discourse about whether they all spoke the same language or simply were able to understand each other's different languages. But either way, they had a shared understanding and a shared purpose, and they did not want their delegation to break apart and be scattered across the earth. They wanted to stay together in what might we call today an echo chamber. In Babel, they had no differences and therefore were so unified that had God not stopped their plans, the commentators say, they would have descended into idol worship. Seeing this, God intervenes. God confounds their speech so they can no longer understand each other, and indeed scatters them across the earth. But it wasn't chaos for chaos's sake. It was a divine act of protection, ensuring that humanity would once again be diverse in language, thought, and expression. What happens next is yet another tragic biblical tale of divine retribution. The people no longer understand one another, and thus their common goals fall by the wayside. No one knew what the other was asking for. If one asked for a brick, the other would bring a lime, they tell us. The former would become so frustrated by the lack of understanding that he would take the brick and throw it at his fellow, killing him. The frustration became so great that, considering the lack of common language and ability to communicate, ultimately, every man took up a sword and they fought one another so vehemently that the text tells us half the world fell. Following this battle, the people are dispersed across the earth. Clans erupted between those who could understand one another, and ultimately the entire world was populated. But it was populated by people who did not understand each other and who had allowed their lack of understanding to lead them to virulent hatred and violence. I found myself drawn to this idea of the Tower of Babel and the inability to communicate over this last week. The idea that an inability to hear one another and really listen can lead to not only societal fractures, but even to violent action is so timely, it's almost spooky. On his podcast this week, Being Jewish with Jonah Platt, Jonah said, "We've got our very own Tower of Babel, and it's called social media. A unifying language that provides every opportunity for frenzied cruelty to flourish like a virus if not kept in check, for Jews and non-Jews alike." It's impossible not to draw parallels between the story of Babel and the way the algorithms to which we have surrendered so much of our lives and psychic energy have siloed us from one another. On the one hand, one could argue that everyone sharing a common language and worldview might be a good thing. It might foster communal connections and shared perspectives. So too with the World Wide Web. We have seen how technology, and particularly social media, can be a source for good, for connection, an antidote to isolation and loneliness. But much like Babel, too much of the same thinking can also be a recipe for division, groupthink, and even violent, vitriolic hatred. Depending on which corner of the internet in which you dwell, you are fed one version of reality that tells a particular story. It's repeated over and over again, meme after meme, video after video, to the point that humanity has become so entrenched in our own understanding of what is real and true that when we are met with another human being who dares to disagree with us, we are often sent into a rage. To quote Jonah Platt one more time, he says, "We are these weak and fallible human beings, and at one point or another, we will be overtaken by emotions that lead us to abandon moral vigilance in favor of mob mentality that unleashes the very worst elements of our nature upon the world. Unfortunately, we see this indecency and immorality every day, as our society has normalized the expression of some of these abhorrent habits. We each retreat behind our screens and defend our positions. We follow those with whom we agree, and who, as in Babel, speak a language we can understand. It makes us feel seen, but can also make us feel self-righteous. It can lead to a dangerous level of groupthink, causing us not to question what is presented as facts, and to completely shut down our willingness to listen to the perspective of others if it differs from our own." In a recent article in the Times of Israel, Ryan Aviv Fagan wrote, "The Jewish people are an ancient, diverse, ever-evolving family. We're not a monolith, and we never have been. From the deserts of Sinai to the streets of Warsaw to the synagogues of Los Angeles, we have always prayed in different ways, thought in different languages, and wrestled with God and tradition on our own terms. And yet through pogroms, exile, genocide, and modern statehood, we have survived. Not by demanding uniformity, but by holding on to unity. Our fragile but sacred unity." The generation of the Tower of Babel tried to correct the chaos of the generation of the flood, but they went too far in the other direction. Instead of anarchy, they created rigid conformity, and neither extreme is what God desires. We learn from this story that too much of the same thinking is dangerous and even at odds with the divine plan. God doesn't want us all to think the same way. That was never the purpose of creation. Look at this week's Parsha, Vayera. In this story, we're told of the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah, cities that once again descended into chaos and violence. I think we're learning something about human nature. God once again wants to destroy the cities because there's a lot of divine wrath in the early chapters of Genesis. But Abraham, our forefather, the first man of faith, does not simply go along with the plan. Abraham argues with God and tries desperately to negotiate on behalf of humanity and the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. His attempt is unsuccessful, and God destroys the cities anyway. But what we see in this story is Abraham answering the divine call to enter into covenant, but maintaining his sense of morality and individuality enough that he is able to question what is right and true, even if that means questioning God. It's a risky move. One might assume that to question God would lead to a certain death, but no. God engages in the debate with Abraham. God celebrates Abraham's individuality and welcomes dissenting opinion. It doesn't change the outcome, but it's an example of the fact that we are each created differently, with unique thought patterns, perspectives, and talents. The goal is not uniformity, but individuality in service of the divine. The Tower of Babel reminds us that when we stop listening, we stop seeing each other as human. And Vayera reminds us that faith begins with conversation, even argument sometimes, and with the courage to hear and to be heard. May we learn to build not towers that separate us, but communities grounded in empathy, curiosity, and sacred diversity. In a world that often rewards volume over nuance, may we strive to be like Abraham, willing to question, to listen, and to stand for what is right, even when it's uncomfortable. Our task is not to speak one language, but to speak to one another across differences with compassion and with integrity. God didn't scatter humanity to divide us, but to remind us that holiness is found in our differences. Vayera calls us to use our voices, our hearts, and even our screens to rebuild the world, not as Babel's tower, but as Abraham's tent, open on all sides, welcoming every story, every truth, and every soul. Shabbat Shalom.